I was a respected physician. White coat, residents hanging on to my every word, patients bringing flowers after discharge. Everything followed protocol until the night the insurance company denied a medication that could save a life. I knew that if I obeyed, he would die. I administered the drug. The patient's heart began to beat again, and a week later, I was called to court because I had broken the rules, because I chose to save a life instead of follow policy. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Dr. Sarah Brennan. I was 47 years old and had spent over 2 decades wearing a white coat that came to feel more like armor than clothing. I worked as an attending physician in the intensive care unit of a large private hospital in Northern California. On paper, I had everything I ever wanted: credentials, authority, and a reputation that preceded me. My name was printed in conference programs and hospital newsletters. Interns respected me. Nurses trusted me. Patients looked at me like I was their last chance, and I wore that responsibility like a second skin. Each morning started the same way: black coffee, too hot to drink at first sip, and a quiet ride through traffic as the sun stretched over the hills. The hospital parking lot buzzed with the same energy every day: doctors, techs, paramedics moving in practiced choreography. I parked in the same spot, swiped the same badge, nodded at the same security guard, and walked the same polished halls to my office on the 3rd floor. The rhythm of it all gave me comfort. There was no chaos in structure, no uncertainty in routine. Everything had its place. I reviewed charts with the precision of someone who'd long since memorized the dance of symptoms and systems: vitals, labs, imaging, patterns. Medicine, to me, was a language I spoke fluently, a language where each value, each number, told a story I could translate. My notes were always detailed, my assessments conservative but thoughtful. I believed in protocol, in process, in the accumulated wisdom of evidence-based care. Not because I lacked instinct, but because instinct alone doesn't hold up in court. My days were long but rarely unpredictable. In the ICU, patients lived in liminal space, neither healing nor dying quickly. Most were elderly, some were young and unlucky. I walked from room to room like a quiet sentinel, adjusting drips, changing plans, discussing code statuses with exhausted families. I had learned to speak about death without emotion, to deliver impossible truths with the practiced cadence of someone who knew how to carry the unbearable without making it worse. I had sacrificed a lot for that stability. My marriage ended when I was 38. My daughter, Emily, lived across the country in New York, finishing her degree in environmental science. We spoke once a week. She resented my absences growing up, though she rarely said it aloud. I sent her care packages, overcompensated during holidays, and convinced myself she understood. Love, I had come to believe, could be quiet and distant and still present, like a vital sign that stayed steady, even when no one noticed it. At work, I was the one others came to for clarity. I served on ethics committees. I trained residents. I reviewed peer protocols and audited medication trials. If there was a gray zone, I outlined its edges in black. Not because I feared risk, but because I believed every decision carried weight, and that weight should never be borne carelessly. People often asked if it was hard, making life and death decisions every day. They imagined the drama, the anguish, the adrenaline. But the truth is, most of it wasn't like that. It was paperwork. It was caution. It was long hours of managing machines and bodies and systems. What felt heroic from the outside often felt mechanical from within. You learned to detach or you didn't survive. Still, I cared. I cared more than I let anyone see. I remembered names. I kept thank you cards pinned inside my locker. I visited families after discharges. I kept journals where I recorded the cases that haunted me, not the ones with clear endings, but the ones that slipped through the cracks, the almosts, the what ifs. There was a boy once, 17, motor vehicle accident, brain dead on arrival. His mother sat by his side for 3 days before agreeing to withdraw care. She thanked me with tears in her eyes, said I made the impossible bearable. I never told anyone that I cried in my car that night, alone, before driving home. But those moments were rare. Most days were predictable, measured, safe. The hospital administration knew me as someone who didn't make waves. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't emotional. I didn't get involved in politics. I followed guidelines, documented everything, and stayed within the lane of clinical safety. That earned me respect and autonomy. It meant I could request off-label treatments when justified. It meant my name on a decision carried weight. And I liked it that way. Control, to me, wasn't about power. It was about protection. From mistakes, from regret, from the chaos that crept in when the rules were bent, even for good reason. I'd seen what happened to doctors who crossed lines. I'd testified in board reviews, watched careers dissolve because of a missing signature, a misread scan, a protocol skipped in a moment of panic. I told myself I would never be that doctor. I would never gamble with someone's life, not even if the odds were in my favor. So I lived in that balance. I let the protocols be my shield. I let my steady record be my proof that I belonged, that I was good, that I was enough. It worked. For years, it worked. Until it didn't. Because sometimes the line you're told not to cross is the very one that separates life from death. And when that moment came, when the clock ticked louder than the rules, when a human life hung in the balance and the system demanded patience, I had to choose, not between right and wrong, but between obedience and compassion. But that part comes later. Before that day, I was still Dr. Brennan, still the rule follower, still the woman with clean charts, sharp penmanship, and a spotless record, still the one who believed that stability was the same thing as safety. I didn't yet know that following every rule doesn't always make you right, and breaking one, just one, can make you human. He came in just after midnight, rolled through the ER doors on a gurney with too many tubes and not enough time. His name was Thomas Everett, 52, divorced, a laborer with no primary physician, and a long-standing history of diabetes and renal failure. The transfer documents were incomplete, hastily faxed from a small rural hospital 3 counties away. What they made clear, however, was this: the man was septic, advanced, deteriorating, and no one there could manage him. I was called in because the ICU was full, and I had experience with critical admissions. The ER team had already started fluids, drawn labs, and set up a central line, but his blood pressure remained dangerously low, and his oxygen levels hovered just above nothing. His skin had the mottled, waxy look that told me we were dangerously close to losing him. His body stank of infection and time, the smell that lived behind masks and sterile gloves, the kind that whispered of things too far gone. As I read his chart, I saw the familiar dance between clinical urgency and administrative hesitation. No insurance, Medicaid pending. The previous hospital had stabilized him just long enough to justify the transfer. I didn't blame them. I'd seen it before. A desperate shuffle of the poor and dying, passed between hospitals like inconvenient secrets, each hoping the next would take responsibility. This time, he landed on my table. I ordered a round of broad-spectrum antibiotics and adjusted his fluids, but I knew we were behind. He needed vasopressors to support his collapsing blood pressure, and more than that, he needed a specific drug, one not covered under our standard formulary unless pre-approved through a review process that could take hours, sometimes days. Drotrecogen alpha, rarely used, expensive, and flagged by insurance as experimental. But I'd seen it work, and for patients in severe septic shock, it was often the line between life and death. The nurse looked at me when I mentioned it, her expression cautious, waiting to see which version of myself I would be that night. I asked her to page pharmacy and start the application process. She nodded but didn't move. We both knew the odds. He was uninsured, and the drug was flagged. Approval would be unlikely. Even if it came, it wouldn't be fast enough. I stood at the foot of his bed and watched the monitor slide downward, a slow, mechanical goodbye. His heart rate was erratic, his breathing shallow and irregular. His body was shutting down in front of me, and I felt my usual sense of clinical detachment begin to slip. Not because I knew him, not because there was anything extraordinary about his story, but because he was dying, and I could stop it, if they would let me. I called the hospitalist on duty, pushed the case, argued the criteria. He agreed with my assessment, but said his hands were tied. The rules were the rules. The treatment plan had to go through the committee, a committee that did not sit at 3 in the morning, a committee that had never stood beside a bed and watched a man suffocate on his own blood. I hung up the phone before I said something I couldn't take back. I tried everything I could within protocol, maximized fluids, recalibrated dosages, monitored every possible metric, but nothing changed. His blood pressure was now unreadable by cuff. His skin had turned a bluish gray. His fingers twitched with the last static charges of a nervous system under siege. The nurse stood silently, her hands trembling just enough to tell me she felt it too. The futility, the rage. I stepped out of the room and walked down the corridor. The hallway lights buzzed above me, casting long shadows across the waxed floor. I paused in front of the medication room, my ID badge heavy around my neck. I looked at the locked cabinet, the shelves behind glass. I thought about the price tag. I thought about his life, and I thought about the oath. I had taken it so long ago, when I was still wide-eyed and naive, before I knew what it meant to practice medicine inside a machine built on profit margins and coverage codes. But that night, I remembered it clearly. First, do no harm, but also relieve suffering, preserve life, act in the best interest of the patient. So I made the call. I opened the cabinet, withdrew the vial, and administered the dose. No paperwork, no approval, no committee, just a decision, my decision. For hours, I sat by his bed, monitoring the vitals. The nurse stayed with me, silent but present, watching the numbers like we were praying. Slowly, his blood pressure began to rise. His oxygen saturation improved. His skin warmed ever so slightly. The rhythm of his heart evened out. At dawn, he opened his eyes. They were cloudy, dazed, but alive. He looked at me like I was just another face in a long string of nights. He didn't know what I'd done. He didn't know the risk. He just knew he wasn't dead. Later that morning, the pharmacy flagged the missing vial. The system noticed the unapproved administration. A report was filed. Questions were asked. I told the truth, and then the silence began. I expected gratitude. Instead, I got protocol. I expected understanding. Instead, I got lawyers. The hospital launched an internal review. I was placed on administrative leave, pending investigation. The official reason was failure to follow the chain of authorization. The unofficial reason was far simpler. I had used a resource on a man whose life was deemed not worth the cost. In a meeting filled with suits and clipboards, someone used the phrase financial non-viability. Not about the drug, about the patient, about Thomas Everett, 52, laborer, septic, uninsured. His survival disrupted a spreadsheet, and my decision disrupted their hierarchy. I sat in that room, calm on the outside, burning on the inside. Not with regret, but with the clarity of knowing that the system I had served so obediently for so long would rather see a man die than lose control. And I had broken that control, not to be a hero, but because I was still a doctor, and he was still a human being. And sometimes that's enough to cost you everything. The first notice arrived folded neatly on letterhead, slid under my office door before I returned from rounds. It was impersonal, almost elegant in its phrasing, a notification of internal investigation, a request for presence at a preliminary disciplinary hearing. The tone was calm, clinical, bureaucratic. It used words like noncompliance and unauthorized action, not life-saving or urgent, not human, just procedural language, careful and cold. I read the letter twice, then placed it back into the envelope with fingers that remained oddly steady. The storm hadn't arrived yet, just the warning winds brushing past my face with the unmistakable chill of consequence. I was removed from the schedule the next day, quietly, efficiently, as if my presence on the ICU floor had been a clerical error. My badge still worked, but the security team had been notified. I could enter the building, but not patient areas. I could attend the hearing, but not touch a chart. The same hospital that once trusted me to make life and death decisions now treated me as if I might smuggle in a syringe and start another act of defiance. The hearing room was windowless and too bright. A long table, 3 chairs on one side, one on the other. I recognized 2 of the physicians on the committee, colleagues who once shared coffee with me between cases, who used to ask for my opinion on tricky intubations or obscure differentials. Now they avoided my eyes. The third was a hospital administrator, someone I had met only in passing, a man with a polished tie and a voice honed for HR. They read from a prepared statement. Their expressions were neutral, carefully blank, as if their faces had been scrubbed of empathy before the meeting. I sat still, hands folded, my white coat replaced with a simple navy blazer. The absence of that coat felt heavier than the coat itself ever had. They asked me to explain why I had administered Drotracogan alpha without formal approval. I explained, calmly, clearly. I told them about the timing, the deteriorating vitals, the prior knowledge I had from similar cases, the evidence-based rationale behind the decision. I laid it out not as justification, but as fact, as medical judgment, as the very thing I had been trained to do. They nodded, took notes. One of them asked if I had considered the consequences of acting outside protocol. I answered honestly, yes, and I would do it again. That answer settled something in the room. The administrator leaned forward, hands clasped. He used the word liability. He used the word exposure. He used the word precedent. Not once did he use the word patient. They suspended me with pay, pending further review. The phrase echoed in my head for days, like a sentence with no end. News spread quickly. Whispers passed through hallways faster than rounds. Nurses lowered their voices when I entered the break room. Colleagues sent polite texts, vague messages of support wrapped in silence. No one wanted to be seen standing too close. I understood. This wasn't about medicine anymore. It was about self-preservation, about which side of the line you chose to stand on when the system raised its voice. The hospital filed a formal report with the state medical board. I received the notification by mail. The envelope was thick. Inside, a list of allegations. Professional misconduct, failure to comply with institutional policy, unauthorized use of restricted medication. There was a line about endangering patient safety that made my stomach turn. Because he had survived. He was walking, talking, alive. But according to the report, that wasn't the point. The point was that I had made a decision without permission. I hired a lawyer, a quiet woman with silver-streaked hair and a firm handshake. She listened without interruption as I explained every detail. When I finished, she nodded once and said, "They're not accusing you of being wrong. They're accusing you of being insubordinate." That word stayed with me. Insubordinate, as if medicine were the military, as if my duty were to the policy, not the patient, as if saving a life outside the correct channels was a kind of treason. The patient, Thomas Everett, had been discharged by then. His recovery was slow but solid. He left a message with the hospital thanking the staff. He mentioned me by name. That note was not included in the investigation materials. I wasn't surprised. I began receiving letters from advocacy groups. Some praised me. Others asked me to speak out. I ignored most of them, not because I didn't care, but because I hadn't yet made peace with what was happening. I was being held accountable for breaking a rule I had long believed was sacred, and yet I still couldn't bring myself to wish I'd done anything differently. I found myself walking through the neighborhood more than usual, long, aimless walks under low skies. I avoided the hospital. I passed it once, on accident, and stopped across the street, staring at the tall glass windows that used to reflect my ambition. I wondered if the patients knew what those windows concealed, if they realized how many decisions were shaped not by medicine, but by money. Late one night, I sat at my kitchen table and reread the medical board's complaint. I highlighted every mention of unauthorized, every phrase that placed protocol above outcome. I made a list of every time I had followed the rules and still lost someone, the names I remembered, the families I couldn't face, the nights I'd spent questioning whether I could have done more. This time, I had done more, and that, somehow, was the problem. The hearing with the board was set for 6 weeks from the date of suspension. My license wasn't yet revoked, but the process had begun. I couldn't practice. I couldn't consult. I couldn't even volunteer without risk of further penalty. I woke up each morning feeling like a ghost inside my own body. The rhythm of hospital life had been stripped away, and in its place was a silence I didn't know how to fill. I watched the news. I read books. I cleaned the same drawer 3 times. I wrote letters I never sent, to Thomas, to Emily, to the doctors who hadn't defended me. And still, I held on to something, small, stubborn, buried deep inside the part of me that had once taken the Hippocratic oath, a belief that medicine was more than policy, that doctors were more than protocol, that doing the right thing should not be a punishable act. But in the eyes of the system, I had crossed a line, and now I was no longer a physician with judgment and experience. I was a case file, an example, a warning. The white coat had once been my shield. It gave me a name, a role, a purpose. It was crisp, bright, and clean even when my hands were tired and my mind frayed. It was what people saw before they saw me, the symbol that let them trust me with their secrets, their pain, their bodies. But after the investigation began, the same coat became a mark. It was no longer a sign of knowledge or care. It was a warning flag, a provocation, a target painted across my back. I still wore it at home sometimes, out of habit. It hung by the door like an artifact from a life that was dissolving. The pockets held nothing but lint and old notes, and yet I would slip my arms into it as if it might remind me of who I had been. But the coat no longer smelled of antiseptic and coffee and hospital corridors. It smelled of absence, of endings, of a reputation unraveling thread by thread. When I left the house, I could feel the shift in the air around me. People looked at me differently, not openly hostile, not even accusatory, just wary. A subtle recoil, like they'd read my name in an article or overheard a fragment of my story. At the grocery store, I caught the cashier glancing at me twice. At the dry cleaner, the woman hesitated before asking for my last name. The news had blurred the details, but it had made me into a narrative. Not Sarah Brennan, physician, not Sarah Brennan, mother, but the doctor who broke the rules, the doctor under investigation, the doctor who thought she knew better. The hospital no longer allowed me to step into patient care areas. I was confined to offices, to empty conference rooms, to places that smelled of stale coffee and carpet cleaner. The badge around my neck now opened only certain doors. Each beep of denial from a restricted entry felt like another small erasure of my identity. Colleagues passed me in hallways with polite nods, but no warmth. Their smiles were practiced, the kind used for strangers on elevators. They were protecting themselves. I understood, but it didn't make the sting any less. I began to notice how quickly trust evaporated. People who had once praised my decisiveness now spoke about due process and institutional integrity. Residents who had shadowed me in the ICU looked away when they passed. Nurses who used to laugh with me in the break room became distant, their eyes slipping past mine as though I were already gone. I had not yet lost my license, but I had already lost my belonging. The media coverage was a slow drip, each article and blog post another pinprick. Headlines turned me into a symbol. Doctor defies protocol. Unauthorized drug administration sparks debate. Some painted me as a martyr, others as reckless. I tried not to read them, but the words still reached me, secondhand, distorted through whispers. Friends called to say they supported me, but asked me not to use their names publicly. Even family members began their sentences with, "I'm sure you had your reasons," instead of, "How are you holding up?" Every morning, I opened my email hoping for something normal, a patient's thank you, a colleague's note about an interesting case. But the inbox was a mix of subpoenas, requests for statements, and solicitations from journalists. Some messages were anonymous threats, calling me a danger, a fraud, a disgrace. Others were desperate pleas from people begging me to speak out, to fight the system, to become their advocate. I deleted most without answering. My life had become a stage, and strangers were writing the script. At night, the silence grew heavier. Without the hospital's rhythm, Without the constant movement and purpose, the days blurred into one another. I cleaned my apartment until it shone. I organized files. I jogged around the neighborhood like a restless animal. Nothing eased the static inside me. I dreamed of hospital corridors, of alarms sounding, of hands pulling me back as I tried to reach a patient. I woke with my heart pounding and my palms damp, gripping sheets like restraints. One afternoon, I drove past the hospital parking lot and saw a group of medical students entering through the main doors. They looked young and certain, their white coats swinging at their knees. I sat in my car watching them for a long time. I remembered what it felt like to be that sure, to believe that medicine was a straight line, that knowledge and ethics would always point you toward the right choice. I wondered if anyone had ever told them how fragile that certainty was, how quickly it could fracture under pressure from forces they didn't yet understand. I tried to volunteer at a free clinic in another county, thinking I could still be useful. The director smiled apologetically and said they couldn't risk it while the investigation was ongoing. Risk it? As if I were an infection they might catch. I thanked her anyway and drove home in silence. The radio played a commercial for malpractice insurance, a jingle so cheery it felt obscene. The white coat stayed hanging by the door. I stopped putting it on. It no longer fit, even though the fabric hadn't changed. It belonged to a version of me who believed she was protected by doing the right thing. It belonged to someone who still thought the system and the oath were the same thing. Now it was just a piece of cloth, and wearing it felt like a lie. Sometimes I sat at my kitchen table with the coat folded in my lap, running my fingers over the embroidered name on the chest. The stitching had begun to fray. It was strange, the way something could unravel quietly, one fiber at a time, until it was no longer whole. That was how I felt. Threads slipping, seams loosening, the outline of who I had been coming apart in my own hands. The hearings dragged on. Each session, another hour of listening to strangers dissect my choices, reduce them to bullet points and policies. I spoke when asked. I stayed calm. I didn't cry. But every time I walked out of the building, I felt the coat growing heavier, even though it wasn't on my shoulders. A weight made of scrutiny, of suspicion, of being seen not as a healer, but as a transgressor. The white coat had once been a symbol of belonging. Now it was a warning, a sign that I had stepped out of line. I had crossed from doctor to defendant, from trusted to questioned, from inside to out. And in that crossing, I learned something I had never wanted to know, that the very thing you think will protect you can become the easiest target to hit. There came a point when I stopped expecting the phone to ring with good news. Every vibration in my pocket felt like a summons, every envelope in the mailbox a verdict. I no longer hoped for apologies or vindication. What I hoped for was smaller. Dignity, maybe. Silence without suspicion. A single day without having to defend the moment I chose to save a life. The hospital was still conducting its review. The state medical board still hadn't decided whether to strip my license. My world was held together by technicalities and grace periods. I existed in a space between titles. No longer doctor in the active sense, not yet former doctor in the official one. I was the gray in the system's black and white, an exception it didn't know how to categorize. I tried to distract myself with logic. I read through every clause in my employment contract. I highlighted the policies I had allegedly violated. Section 14B, Unauthorized Administration of Medication. Section 22C, Breach of Institutional Protocol. Section 27D, failure to obtain prior authorization when required by insurance-based regulations. There, in cold legal language, was the case against me. Neat, clinical, sterile. The document didn't care that the man I had treated was alive. It cared that I had bypassed the flowchart. It was a strange kind of mourning, to lose your faith not in medicine, but in the machinery wrapped around it. For years, I had believed the system was flawed but functional. Now I saw it for what it was, a machine built not to heal, but to protect itself. I wasn't punished because I was wrong. I was punished because I had dared to believe the oath I took meant more than the contract I signed. I found myself revisiting the words of that oath late at night, like scripture. I remembered the room where I stood, fresh out of medical school, reciting it alongside my classmates. First, do no harm. I will apply, for the benefit of the sick, all measures that are required. I will not permit considerations of age, disease, or creed to intervene between my duty and my patient. The words had felt sacred then, heavy with purpose. Now they felt like a rebellion. Somewhere along the way, we had stopped teaching that medicine was a human act. We taught technique. We taught billing codes. We taught defensive documentation. But we didn't teach courage. We didn't teach what it meant to look at a dying man, know what he needs, and be told to wait for permission. And when someone like me chose to act anyway, the machine didn't adjust. It attacked. People began to reach out. Not hospital administrators or old colleagues, most of them stayed silent, but patients, families, strangers. A man whose wife had died waiting for an insurance approval wrote to thank me. A young nurse told me she kept a copy of my story in her locker to remind herself that she wasn't crazy for wanting more. They saw what I had done not as a violation, but as a return to something sacred. The attention scared me. I didn't want to be a symbol. I didn't want to be famous for a decision that, in my eyes, should have been the baseline of decency. But the system had twisted the act of care into a question of compliance, and in that distortion, people saw their own pain. An independent journalist requested an interview. She had been following the case and wanted to tell the story from my perspective. I agreed, against my lawyer's advice. I didn't want to fight the hospital in court or the state on paper. I wanted to tell the truth, plainly, without spin. I wanted someone to hear what it felt like to stand in a room with a man who was dying and be told to wait. I wanted someone to hear the sound the monitor made when his vitals stabilized after I gave the drug. I wanted someone to understand that I had not acted recklessly. I had acted because I could not live with doing nothing. The interview went viral. The journalist wrote with compassion, with clarity, with a sharp eye for the absurdity of what had happened. The headline quoted me directly. I took an oath to a patient, not a policy. It became a rallying cry, reposted and shared. I was invited to speak at ethics panels. Medical students sent letters. Someone printed the quote on a protest sign at a healthcare rally in D.C. And still, the investigation continued. The hospital called a press conference. They framed their statement carefully, committed to patient safety, grateful for the service of all employees, but also clear that policies exist for a reason. They didn't name me, but they didn't have to. Everyone already knew. The administrators stood behind a podium wrapped in logos and spoke of integrity, as if the word alone could cover the fact that a man nearly died because they were waiting for a fax. I watched from my living room, no longer surprised by the theater. I knew this wasn't about truth. It was about precedent. If they allowed what I had done to go unpunished, they would open a door they were desperate to keep shut. A door where doctors could choose patients over paperwork. a door where oaths could challenge contracts. And yet, the door was already open. I could feel it in the letters I received. I could hear it in the trembling voices of young residents asking what they should do next time. I could see it in the fear behind the silence of those still inside the system. Something had cracked, and the pressure was building. I had become a fracture point, unwillingly, uncomfortably, but undeniably. The Hippocratic Oath and the hospital contract were at war, and I stood in the no man's land between them. I began to think about what kind of doctor I wanted to be, if I could be one at all. My license was still under review. The odds were not in my favor. If they took it, I wouldn't be able to practice again, at least not in any way that resembled what I had done before. But I had already lost something greater than my job. I had lost my belief that the system valued the same things I did. I started writing more, not just statements for the board, but essays, speeches, pages of reflection scrawled into notebooks. I wrote about the patients we fail, the ones we delay, the ones we ignore because their insurance doesn't pay enough. I wrote about the quiet brutality of compromise, about the way institutions train you to shrink your instincts until you don't trust your own judgment. I wrote about fear and what it costs to act in spite of it, and I wrote about Thomas Everett, not as a case, but as a person. His breath rattling and shallow, his pulse flickering like a candle about to go out, his eyes when they finally opened, cloudy but there, present, alive. I wrote about that moment over and over again because it reminded me that what I did mattered, even if they punished me for it, even if they erased my name from every plaque and login, even if I never wore the white coat again. I would remember that moment, and I would remember who I was when I chose to act. The letter from the medical board arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick envelope, pale gray. I knew what it meant before I opened it. I sat on the kitchen floor with the envelope in my hands for several minutes, watching the steam rise from my untouched coffee. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a long, slow storm. When I finally opened it, the words blurred for a moment before coming into focus. License suspended indefinitely. No revocation, not yet. Just the end of something that had once defined the entire architecture of my life. There was no ceremony in the undoing, no final patient, no farewell from colleagues, just the quiet bureaucratic decoupling of identity from purpose. One paragraph ended 25 years of medicine. It was astonishing how little it took. For a few days after, I drifted in a fog of inertia. I did laundry, watered plants, answered emails with polite brevity. People sent messages, some offering sympathy, others cloaked in careful neutrality. My lawyer called, her voice low and measured, to say we had options for appeal, but I barely registered her words. I nodded into the phone and said I'd think about it, even though I already knew I wouldn't. I wasn't interested in fighting for a return to something that had asked me to forget why I became a doctor in the first place. Instead, I packed my white coat into a box and stored it in the closet, not with bitterness, but with a quiet kind of grief. It had been both armor and weight, and now it was just fabric. I folded it slowly, running my fingers over the worn edges of the collar, the embroidered name above the pocket. For so many years, that coat had been the most recognizable part of me, but the person inside it had changed. I spent long walks thinking about the oath I had taken. The words came back to me like a heartbeat, steady, insistent, not because I had to remember them, but because they were stitched into me, deeper than policy, older than contracts. I had recited them as a student with reverence, not yet knowing how often they would be tested. I understood them now, not as a promise to institutions, but as a promise to the vulnerable, to the gasping man on a gurney, to the woman too scared to ask a question, to the family sitting in silence outside a closed ICU door. The system had asked me to violate that promise in the name of structure. I had chosen not to. That decision cost me my position, my reputation, my place inside the marble and glass building that had once been my sanctuary. But I had kept the oath. That mattered more. I left the city. I rented a small apartment near the edge of a quiet town in northern Oregon. The windows overlooked pine trees, and the night smelled of wood smoke and damp soil. I slept for the first time in months without dreaming of machines and monitors. I didn't tell anyone what I had done. No one recognized me. I was just a woman buying groceries, reading on park benches, walking without a badge. But still, I needed to be of use. A friend from residency, one of the few who hadn't vanished, connected me with a nonprofit hospice network. They didn't ask about the suspension. They just asked if I could sit with patients, not as a doctor, just as a presence, a listener, someone who knew how to hold silence. So I did. I sat by bedsides in low-lit rooms where families had stepped away, where machines had been turned off. I held hands cooled by morphine. I listened to last stories told in half sentences. I sang softly once when a woman asked for a hymn I didn't know, so I hummed instead. In those moments, I felt something return to me. Not prestige, not status, just purpose. I didn't need a license to bear witness. I didn't need permission to be human with someone who was dying. Occasionally, someone would ask what I used to do. I'd say I worked in medicine. That was all. Most didn't ask further. They were too close to the edge to care about credentials. They wanted presence, not pedigree. One day, a young hospice nurse found an article about me online. She brought it up gently, cautiously. I braced for judgment. Instead, she looked at me and said, "I think you did the right thing." It wasn't absolution. It wasn't exoneration. But it was enough. Word spread quietly through the hospice community. A few asked me to speak at trainings, to talk about ethics, not from a podium, but from the place where ethics live when theory collapses under real life. I told my story not to glorify it, but to remind them that the system was not built to carry the weight of compassion. That weight was ours, and sometimes it broke us, but sometimes it didn't. Sometimes we chose to live by the oath anyway. I wrote mostly at night, under the low hum of the heater and the occasional hoot of an owl outside the window. Essays, letters, pages of reflection I never sent. I wrote for the version of myself who had once believed that playing by the rules was the same as doing right. I wrote for the residents just entering the field, for the patients who never knew how close they came to being denied. I wrote to remember that a life saved was never a mistake. The world moved on. New headlines, new scandals. My name faded from the public eye, which was a kind of mercy. I was no longer the doctor who broke the rules. I was just Sarah. I wore soft clothes. I carried a thermos of tea. I sat beside the dying and told them they were not alone. I lived quietly, but I lived by the oath, and that, at last, was enough.